Peter, you spent years stationed in post-Saddam Iraq, and yesterday Defense Secretary Ashton Carter announced that the U.S. will once again begin direct action on the ground in Iraq. How do we mess this up so bad that we're sending troops back, and are these troops really necessary?
I listened to that yesterday, stunned, absolutely stunned. I can't believe that we are re-engaging on the ground in Iraq. And anybody who thinks this is over and that the United States has taken, the last step it's going to take in this conflict is an absolute fool. Let's look back real quick at the history. We left Iraq in 2011 at the very end of the year, and we managed to stay the heck out for about 2 years or so. In summer of 2014, Obama brought us back in, claiming that the Yazidi people in northern Iraq, who no one had really heard of before, needed to be saved from ISIS, and there was going to be a brief humanitarian mission. That morphed into a bombing campaign, which morphed into bombing in Iraq and Syria, which morphed into over 3,000 American trainers on the ground in Iraq, which now has morphed into, despite the promises of no boots on the ground in both Iraq and Syria. Once you start that kind of escalation, there's really not an easy end to it. You can't say, well, we're going to put these commandos in, and if they get in trouble, well, gosh, we're going to need some more guys to help them out, and we're going to have a logistical chain that's going to go in there. We've got to have search and rescue to pull them out. We need medical. We need this. We need that. And all of a sudden, you've got a bunch of people in there. As another example, when you talk about Delta Force or one of these people going in to raid, oftentimes what you need around them is blocking forces. You don't want to have the bad guys have access to the same house that you're inside of raiding. Typically, that work is done by Rangers or an airborne unit. We saw that, I think, in Black Hawk Down, for example, in the public media. Well, where are those people? You're going to let the Kurds do that? You're going to let the Iraqi army do that? The Shia militias under Iranian control do that? No. This is an open door now to increased engagement, and I'm not sure where the end is, and I'm not sure what the goal is.
I think the scary part, Josh, how concerning is it that we're just now he's saying, yes, we're going to do direct action on the ground, but we know that they've already done direct action on the ground because a Delta commando died just last week. And I'm willing to bet that wasn't the first mission of that nature that happened.
Peter's right in that whenever you send troops, especially the more troops you send, the more people they need to support them. If you have a post with, 5,000-10,000 troops, a lot of those, as mechanics to keep the vehicles running, human resources people to handle pay and benefits. It's an entire operation. But that said, I haven't really heard any, or at least found yet, any specific troop figures that Carter's talking about. And we already have troops on the ground there, in the quote-unquote advisory role already. So I think really what's happening is that they're being sort of more forthcoming about what is going on in Iraq. And, the fact that they are saying that we're going to be doing more ground raids, whatever that means in this context, I don't think that necessarily means this is Iraq War II, but I also think that the ISIS threat has been underestimated by Iraq War III, yes. No, the other one was Kuwait. We didn't actually go in. It was like a prelude to war. But again, I don't think that this means this is going to be a huge thing this time, but you never know, because again, it's not up to us. It's up to really however the troops and the commanders are handling us. That mission is. I think that's the question we should be asking: is what is their mission, rather than hemming and hawing about what this means in terms of a larger Iraq conflict.
Well, Iraq is one thing, but Carter also mentioned Syria, perhaps, and if are we going to go like put boots on the ground in Syria, and isn't that going to put us on a collision course with Russia, Peter?
Well, sure. Carter mentioned that one of the strategies, one of the goals, if you will, is for whatever side we're supporting to take back Raqqa, the city where ISIS is sort of centered, if you will. And he said that we're going to have direct action there. We're going to have trainers on the ground. You're opening a door here that the president told us over a year ago was shut. He was explicit about not putting combat troops in there in either country, that this was going to be an air campaign, a support campaign, what have you. That isn't what's happened. And I agree with Josh that we don't really know where this goes. I mean, we can't predict the future, but the curve is definitely in the escalation mode here. And that's what very much concerns me. At the same time, this idea of mission is very important. What are you hoping to accomplish? And realistically, can you accomplish that? Right now,
Peter, if I can just jump in for a second. I mean, but my other part of my point that I maybe didn't make clear or didn't make clear enough was that, you know, when they said that thing that Obama said about no troops on the ground, I mean, that was bullshit when he said it. I think that anyone, at least in the military, knew that anytime you say, you know, we're going to go up to this line in a military mission, and this is the line we're going to only go up to, it's either going to work or what, we're going to walk away. We've never done that in the history of the country, except maybe Reagan in Lebanon, maybe.
Yeah, how'd that work out?
But I do think you're right that the trend is toward escalation. But again, I feel like it's more that what they're admitting to is catching up to the reality versus them actually ramping things up. But if they're telling us, it means that probably is coming.
Yeah, and the catching up with reality, I had a piece this week, which I caught a lot of flack over prior to Carter's statement, suggesting that all the noise that was being made about the Delta Force guy, Josh Wheeler, getting killed was really part of prepping the battlefield, getting Americans ready to accept casualties coming back out of these wars. So, no, I agree with you completely. The concern on my part is both for escalation per se, and also the idea that this seems to be escalation without really much of a plan behind it. We don't know what else to do, so we might as well escalate. The strategy is, as best I can figure it out, and the goal, as best I can figure it out, is kill every ISIS guy. And I think, you're laughing at that because it makes no sense. I mean, ISIS, in fact, has done a terrific job of recruiting more people and for pulling in people in the region to support that. And so some kind of campaign of attrition, which is what kill every ISIS guy basically translates into, is destined to fail. It's failed throughout America's wars. It basically is what drove us out of Vietnam in the end, is the other side was able to sustain more casualties than we were willing to do. And I suspect the same thing will happen here. We can't blow up every ISIS fighter, and that seems to be the only sort of argument we've made so far. It will not work.
Well, okay, so with Syria, we're at war with Iraq, Syria, Yemen, doing operations in Pakistan, Afghanistan. Eric, are we just in the war with the entire Middle East now, and is Canada going to help?
Well, I hope Canada doesn't help. Trudeau says he's pulling out the troops, so that's good. But now that it's my turn to maybe have a chance to talk, I'd like to add to the previous conversation a little bit. I do agree.
I'm sorry, Senator Webb.
Yeah.
Please. I'm running independent now. But I find it interesting because having studied the Cold War extensively and Vietnam was one of my main focuses, you see a lot of parallels now, which disappeared for a while, actually, because following Vietnam War, we learned a couple things. When the U.S. commits to a war, they can never do it in stages. It always has to be a full commitment from the beginning, or it'll turn into another quagmire. Well, this is what we're seeing happening now in Iraq. We're just slowly building it up, and it's going to be a failure. Number two, especially when we went into the first George Bush presidency, was that any American war had to have minimal to no casualties. And we've seen that more and more now with the drone strikes and fighting war without actual boots on the ground. But once again, that rule has now been broken as we're recommitting to Iraq. So I find it interesting to see that all these lessons we've learned through history and really have avoided for a while as much as we can have been forgotten suddenly. And it's interesting because I think, the Middle East for the U.S. is their modern day Vietnam, and they're going to be stuck in there as long as they're trying to police the globe. And part of that is trying to still prove themselves to Russia that they're a credible nation that's willing to stand up for their allies. And in a way, maybe we are entering a second Cold War. It's possible.
Well, here's the thing, Eric. I just think it's the difference between Vietnam and the global jihad problem is that, the Vietnamese weren't coming over to America or planning to go to Europe to attack civilians. I mean, the terrorism threat is real. It's not nearly perhaps what has been made to be or how it's been employed in our national rhetoric. People have been played fast and loose with playing the terror card, but that doesn't change the fact that, just not even a month ago, in Turkey, ISIS, or someone, I don't remember who, I thought it was ISIS, but there was a big explosion during a peace rally. These things will happen. So I do think that you're right that there are some parallels, but I do think the threat isn't as existential as, say, the threat of the Soviet Union was.
But I think you have to look at it contextually. Everything is contextual to the time period. So at the time, communism was the major threat. Now terrorism is our modern day threat. Not to downplay the role of terrorism, it is very strong. But I'm sure if you were to talk to any people living in countries that border the Soviet Union or in more poor regions, it was a very real threat that communism would spill over and infect their country.
Well, it's important to remember, and unfortunately, I'm old enough to have lived through the Cold War in real time. The threat was that the Russians were coming. They were coming in terms of nuclear attack on us. We weren't saying that the Russians were going to sneak over our borders or anything like that. But the idea was that at any moment, Russian missiles could start falling on the United States. And I remember as a kid in elementary school, we had drills where we hid under our desk and were told that if the missiles came, we should stay away from the windows. And there was lots of talk of that. Going to the Vietnam War, it's important to remember that there were people who were claiming, this is where the phrase, if we don't fight them over there, we'll fight them over here, that at some point the North Vietnamese would be storming the beaches of California. That was actually mentioned seriously in some vein. So there's a long history of this and a lot of contextual parallels, as Eric was pointing out. I think the thing that makes this far worse than the Vietnam War, of course, is that there are so many other sides here. In Vietnam, we were supporting one side and fighting against the other side, and they had their supporters, yada, yada. But, it was still basically a binary kind of thing. With the Middle East, there's so many different players. But all that said, I think the question of terrorism is all too often, as you said, play the terrorism card, is used as a justification for almost everything, and the level of fear is artificially cranked up. The United States has suffered one cataclysmic terror event in its entire history, and that was 14 years ago. With respect to the dead, and I live here in New York, with respect to the dead, we have killed off, sacrificed, if you will, almost double the number of Americans in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as died on 9/11. And we have also revisited our democracy and put in place things that have taken away our basic rights, all of these things. And the terrorist attacks that have been provoked against us and have been provoked in Europe are largely, on a geopolitical scale, not much more than sort of annoying crimes. We've talked here before about the mass shootings in the United States that have taken far more lives than terrorism. I think we need to keep this all in respect. And then one final point would be, we also need to ask ourselves how much our actions in the Middle East are actually creating terrorists, in ramping up the threat, and in fact bringing this war into a larger context. Certainly, if Turkey was not involved in the fighting in the Middle East, it's very doubtful that ISIS would find any point in setting off bombs in rallies inside Turkey. There's a lot of issues here, but it's very hard to find a positive side to it.